Good day. Today, as on many other days, the fog of war lies very heavy on events in eastern Ukraine. Let me give one example. There are completely conflicting, in fact, diametrically opposed accounts of what is happening in the Azovstal steelworks. If you go to the Russian side, the Russians say that there is now another attempt to evacuate civilians from the Azovstal steelworks underway, and the Russians have categorically denied Ukrainian claims that they have any plan to try and storm the factory. They say that Putin's order, given a few weeks ago to the Russian military, that the factory should not be stormed, is still in effect. By contrast, if you go to the Ukrainians, they give detailed accounts, or at least they give accounts of battles that are supposed to be happening on within the actual steelworks itself, between Ukrainian troops defending the steelworks and the Russian military. Which is true? Which side is telling the truth? Well, I can't say. I'm not in a position to corroborate this, not for the first time. I am remote from the actual events of the battle. But I'm going to say that I think on balance, again, I would tend to prefer Russian accounts of what is actually going on at Azovstal, which is to say that certainly there is some fighting going on, certainly there is some bombing going on and some shelling going on, but there is no indication of any great attempt by the Russians and by the Russian military to storm the steelworks. And I think that overall the Russians are telling the truth, and Putin's stop order is in fact still in place. Why would the Russians want to storm the steelworks anyway? By all accounts, the Ukrainian troops in the steelworks are steadily running through their remaining supplies of food and ammunition, and their ability to keep resisting must be eroding by the day. After all, they themselves, in rather passionate videos, repeatedly tell us as much. So why should the Russians send their troops into the steelworks, have some of their troops killed in an attempt to storm the steelworks, when surely before very long, in some form, Ukrainian resistance in the steelworks is likely to collapse anyway? And as for the civilians in the steelworks, well, obviously, if the Russians really are trying to extricate whatever remaining civilians are indeed still in the steelworks, then storming the steelworks in a way that would put those civilians at risk makes little sense to me. Anyway, that's my own personal view about this. If you want an overall sense of the fighting, well, I think it is much as I described it in my previous two videos, and now there's been a rather interesting supplement in a piece by the Moon of Alabama, pointing out essentially what I've been saying for some time, and what others have been saying also, which is that the Russians, the main approach that the Russians are taking to the fighting in Donbass is very heavy artillery shelling, grinding down these Ukrainian fortifications. A viewer has sent me recently an email pointing out that the Financial Times itself, in a video, claimed that some of these fortifications in Donbass that the Ukrainians built up over the last 8 years are as much as 20 kilometers deep. So these are complicated, well-constructed, well-designed fortifications. It's not surprising, as I said, that the process of grinding them down is taking a certain amount of time. Now, having said this, there is one particular point which I do want to make today, and which, to my knowledge, no one up to now has actually made, and that is that the entire media coverage of this war both in the West and even surprisingly in Russia itself, basically gives the impression, at least at a general level, that the fighting on the ground is taking place between two parties. The Ukrainian army on the one side and the Russian army on the other. However, if you go into a more detailed, take a more detailed look at reports of what's actually happening in the various fighting fronts in Donbass, then the picture actually becomes completely different. And it becomes immediately clear that a great part of the fighting, perhaps most of the actual infantry fighting, is not taking place between the Ukrainian military and the Russian military, but is happening between the Ukrainian military and the militia of the two republics of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Now, the militia of the Donetsk Republic played a big role in the fighting in Mariupol. It is also the force that is engaging in most of the fighting along the Zaporozhye fronts and in the fighting immediately adjacent to the city of Donetsk. And the Lugansk militia is the force that is doing most of the fighting around Severodonetsk and further north in Kharkiv region. That's not to say that the Russian army itself isn't involved in some of the fighting. Of course it is. And here the major force is the spearhead force that's been gradually, incrementally pushing its way south from Izium, moving steadily towards the Ukrainian concentrations in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But it's probably fair to say that over the last 2 weeks or so, most of the hand-to-hand fighting, as I said, has been between the Ukrainian army and the two militias from the two republics of the Donbass. And this is something which very few people point out, even though, as I said, if you go into the detailed reports, it's obvious. And by the way, it confirms that the fighters of the two Donbass militias, some of them are extremely highly motivated, very well trained soldiers, and they're certainly the equals in every respect of the Ukrainian soldiers that they're fighting. And that, of course, begs a number of questions, because one gets the sense that the major role of the regular Russian military in Donbass, apart from the pressure it's exerting in its advance around Izium city at the moment, is to provide the militia in Donbass with artillery support and air support, and of course with intelligence. So one almost gets the sense that at the moment, whilst the pressure is being put on the Ukrainian defense lines, whilst the pressure on the Ukrainian forces in Donbass steadily increases, the infantry fight is done by the militias, supplemented no doubt by Russian special forces. The air campaign is being conducted by the Russian Air Force, and the Russians, of course, provide overwhelmingly heavy artillery support, which is probably what is causing the Ukrainian army the greatest number of losses. And that, if that is correct, if that analysis is correct, and as I said, if you look at the detailed information from the battlefronts, I think it is, then that also supports a view that I and others have developed for some time, which is that after the first few weeks of March, Russian battlefield losses have fallen very significantly. So what are the Russians planning eventually to do? Well, I think the answer is really fairly straightforward. Once these defense lines are broken, and there's been a number of interesting reports. You can see them all in the Moon of Alabama report from Western media. Once the Ukrainians, under this enormously heavy artillery shelling, finally crack, then the Russian ground troops, the Russian mechanized columns will be unleashed and will start to move in to mop up any remaining resistors and presumably to drive the offensive further as far as the Russians want to take it. Now, that, by the way, also confirms something else, which is that the major role of the Russian regular military up to this point in terms of ground fighting has been in creating this corridor between Crimea and Donbass by taking control of Kherson region and also much of Zaporozhye. And in the earlier Russian advances early in the war, whereby the Russian army moved all the way to Kiev, surrounding and encircling places like Kharkiv and Chernigov and Sumy and all of those. So that was the major work of the Russian regular forces at the beginning of the war. And since then, as I said, with the focus being on artillery and air assets, the actual role of the Russian ground forces has actually been scaled down, with most of the fighting at the moment being done by the Donbass militia. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point. I don't think the Donbass militia gets anywhere near enough credit for the amount of fighting it is actually undertaking. Now, the other thing that the Russians are doing is that they're stepping up their aerial and missile campaign against the whole of Ukraine. And we have more reports of more attacks on refineries, more attacks on the railway system. It is clear that the pressure on Ukraine is steadily increasing. And partly, undoubtedly, this is intended to slow the movement of supplies from Ukraine, from the West to Ukraine, to the battlefronts in Ukraine. But my overall sense is that it isn't just that. It's also, I think, increasingly putting pressure on Ukraine as a country, gradually forcing Ukraine or putting Ukraine in a position where it might eventually be gradually ground down as well. Anyway, that is a brief summary of the points in the battle. As I said, I don't want to I don't want to get into the actual details until we get more information when people start returning from holiday. This is an important holiday period in Russia. Russian commentators return from holidays. It's difficult for me to get a clear picture of what's happening on the individual battlefronts. But overall, Ukraine still is absorbing enormously heavy losses every day, primarily from artillery fire. The militias, the Donbass militias, are doing much of the infantry fighting, and Russian missile strikes continue to be launched all across Ukraine with increasingly devastating economic and logistical consequences for the country. Now, in the meantime, we see growing economic problems in the West, and I've discussed those at length already, and I'm not going to repeat them. But perhaps the most interesting thing, the most interesting fact, is that for the first time, we are seeing actual pushback on an attempt by the European Commission to try to impose a sanctions package. Now, I've been skeptical about that pushback up to now, and I still, on balance, think that the Commission will get what it wants. But it's clear that its drive to impose an all-out ban on oil products in the European Union is now running into very heavy resistance, not just from Hungary, but from a whole series of other East European and Central Asian countries, including Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, perhaps some others. And it's also clear that Hungary, at least, has essentially vetoed proposals that were being made by the Commission to sanction Russian religious leaders, including the Russian Patriarch. Decisions which, by the way, I find personally astonishing and which do make me wonder about the thinking of some of the people who proposed them. But anyway, let's focus briefly on the oil sanctions. It seems that there has been an extremely strong letter sent by the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán to EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in which he has basically made it clear that he thinks that the entire set of proposals for this oil ban that the Commission is coming up with is completely misconceived, and that Hungary cannot support it and will oppose it. And it seems to me that if Orbán is writing letters like this to Ursula von der Leyen, it must be because he feels that he's getting a growing amount of support from other members of the EU, other member states, presumably some of the Central European and East European states. Well, we see whether this holds, but the very fact that the EU Commission has come up against this resistance has apparently caused it to try and offer tweaks to its oil import ban idea. So far as I can see, these are not substantive concessions. They're certainly not substantive enough to satisfy Orbán. But the very fact that the Commission has had to draw back at all must be infuriating for them, and is a sign perhaps that with the economic situation globally now becoming so hard, the EU is for the first time starting to meet sanctions resistance from some of its member states. And I will say this, I'm surprised that it's come about so early in this crisis. Now, I'm going to make one further observation. It does seem to me extraordinary that the EU Commission should be proposing an oil import ban at all, not just because, to my mind, it is economically senseless, I've already explained this, but because it seems to me that it is such a vast expansion of its power to directly interfere in the economic life of the member states of the European Union. If Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and other countries don't want to buy Russian oil, well, that's up to them. They're at perfect liberty to do so. And given that they are far and away the biggest buyers of Russian oil, I would have thought that getting together into a situation where these countries agree between each other that they're not going to import Russian oil, well, that would have most of the effect of the proposed embargo. What this EU embargo appears to be intended to do, obviously it uses the label sanctions in order to justify, is to impose a policy on smaller EU states, which are not really consequential in terms of the scale of the trade, of the oil trade. It seeks to impose upon them decisions that are fundamental to their economic life. And that does make me wonder sometimes whether these sanctions really have very much to do ultimately with Ukraine or Russia at all, and whether they aren't simply another vehicle for an EU power grab over its member states and for the EU to try to discipline and control the economies of some of its more errant members. Anyway, We clearly are in a battle over oil within the EU, one, as I said, which I think the Commission did not expect. And I'm far from confident that Hungary and the other states will be able to hold the line against the bulldozer, the EU bulldozer that is heading towards them. But we shall see. It's interesting that this has turned out to be tougher and more complicated for the EU, certainly than I had expected. And obviously, I'm going to keep a careful eye out on what's on how it's going to play out. Meanwhile, we're getting more and more evidence across Europe that the European public is starting to become increasingly unhappy with the general situation. I gather that support for the war and for arming Ukraine is falling in Germany as Germans begin to sense the deep economic hole in which their country has found itself. We've had a complex set of local elections in Britain, which show both the Conservative and the Labour parties, each of which, by the way, fervently supports the war, struggling to make ground either against each other or indeed in ways that would suggest that they have the support of the British people. I get the sense of a growing political malaise right across Europe, but with a political class still firmly in control, still determined to pursue these policies to the point of destruction and not willing to let go at all, and with no organised challenge that can take it on. So we see some resistance to oil bans from East European states, but we see in the big countries, in Germany, in France, in Spain, within the EU, and also in Britain, which is of course no longer a part of the EU, but which has a major voice in these discussions, we see growing signs of a severe economic recession, which is coming, but great reluctance or great unwillingness or great inability perhaps to find political alternatives to the political leaders who, it seems to me, are leading Europe down a blind alley. Well, I don't know what is going to happen, but I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to make a guess, actually, more a guess than a prediction, which is that as happens with military wars of attrition, when eventually the weaker side, after expending an enormous effort to try to hold the line, finally breaks, which is what I predict is going to happen in Ukraine. So something similar at some point is going to happen in this war of economic attrition that the West has found itself in. Now, here one must make an immediate qualification, an immediate point. There is no conceivable sense in which Russia is the stronger party if we're talking about the economic war. The aggregate economic power of the collective West far exceeds Russia's. But having said that, the Russians, as we've seen, are the commodities superpower, and they've been able to use that to great advantage. And they seem to have a unified political system, and they seem to have very effective technocratic governance, and they seem to be taking measures which are helping them ride out the economic war. Also, one gets the sense that the Russian population has accepted the Kremlin's view that this is an existential struggle for Russia and has rallied behind the Kremlin in this war. So they appear to be willing to accept quite a lot of pain. In the West, things are not so clear. It seems to me that we don't yet have a clear idea of what Western governments are going to do in response to this crisis that they have, in effect, imposed upon themselves. We're getting all kinds of strange decisions like tweakings of interest rates. I know that the 0.5, the 5% increase in interest rates, the 0.5% rise in interest rates in the United States is the highest increase since 2000, the year 2000, but it's still, relative to the scale of the crisis, really a case of almost invisible fine-tuning. So we get tweaks to interest rates, we get odd decisions like apparently the Biden administration buying oil to replenish the US's strategic reserve, even whilst it continues to release oil from that reserve, thereby simultaneously replenishing it and depleting it. So we get these odd decisions, but we don't yet have anything that looks like any kind of economic plan or any real idea of what to do with the economic situation. And the aggregate resources of the West are enormous. They're not being brought to bear in ways that would contain the economic damage. And thirdly, I do wonder whether European populations, it is going to be more in Europe than in the United States, whether European populations really have the long-term stomach for this battle, given that they're not directly affected by it in the way that Russia and indeed Ukraine are. So it seems to me that this war of economic attrition is really now a war between a flabby colossus, the collective West, and a perhaps more focused, though smaller, obviously much smaller, Russia, which feels itself to be under enormous pressure. Now, I'm not certain who's going to win, but I would say that for the moment, the Russians do seem to be many points ahead. And as I said, they do have a plan for a way through. If they're able to do all the things that their central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, said, and come through all of this with a reorganized economy within 2 years, well, then they will have unequivocally and conclusively won the economic war. And I'm going to say that this will be as consequential, in fact, more consequential than the military outcome in Ukraine itself. So it'll be an interesting thing to see how all of this eventually sorts out. But in the meantime, it is clear to me that the West is locked in an economic war of attrition, which it did not expect. It has no plan on how to win it, and to the extent that it is continuing to press ahead with ever more sanctions, it's becoming increasingly clear that these are now finally running up against resistance, which I suspect from this point on will increase and grow. Anyway, that's where we are today. A brief update on a complex situation. More from me soon. Remember, you can also find my analysis on other platforms, on Rumble and on Locals. If you follow any video made by the Duran, by myself or by my colleague Alex Christoforou on Rumble, you can go to the red maroon button at the top. That will take you directly to the Locals homepage, where you can decide to become an active member, publish your own exclusive content, follow the exclusive content that we are increasingly publishing on Locals, and join my Wednesday live streams, which take place every Wednesday, 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, exclusively on Locals. And of course, we're on other platforms too, like the new free speech platform SuperU and Odyssey and others. And you can support us also via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can come to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there. And you can also, of course, support us by ticking the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and by checking your subscription to this channel. Well, thank you for joining me again today. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.